Peyton, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I am thrilled to have you, and you have an incredible story to share. And my job, as I mentioned before we hit record, is to hopefully ask some good questions to allow that story to come out, which I think is going to be very inspirational and motivational to those that are listening to the show. And I know you've followed the show for a while, so really appreciate that as well. And looking forward to this interview. Why don't we start with, for our listeners, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your family, and what a typical day looks like for you right now.
Sure, that's a great place to start, Tim. So I live in Northeast Texas, think middle of Dallas and Shreveport, Louisiana. I've been here most of my life, except for when I went to undergraduate at Texas A&M University. And so I've been a pharmacist now for 2 years. I graduated in 2023. My wife Lindsay and I were married about 7 years ago, and so it's crazy how fast time flies
Mm,
when you get married before school.
mhm.
And we have two little boys. One's about 2.5, and the other one's about 9 months old. So they keep us pretty busy during the day, but I'm very much a non-traditional pharmacist in a lot of the senses of the word. I mentioned I have my undergrad from A&M. That degree is actually in a business degree in agricultural economics. A little bit of backstory on that one too that we can touch on. And I was pretty convinced I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like from the time I got to my senior year, I took a capstone business course that really transformed my mind on small business ownership. I was dead set on being an attorney. All my friends told me I would wanted to be an attorney. The job market for attorneys in the 2010s was not great after the financial crisis, still recovering.
Mhm.
And so I fell in love with small business ownership. And for the next kind of 3 years, that's all I did. Our business was growing really rapidly. We work for a lot of healthcare organizations in the area in carpet and rug cleaning. We do a lot of their environmental services. And so that's what I thought I was going to do the rest of my life. And then disaster kind of struck my family in 2017 when my mom was diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, she was only with us for about 5 more months. But in her 5 months, she lived with a lot of purpose and intentionality and told my brother and I, you guys aren't tied to this business. Don't feel like you have to do this forever. And so my brother was already 1 foot in the new pharmacy school that opened in our hometown. His father-in-law is a pharmacist, and he said, "Why don't you consider this?" We were really impressed with the pharmacist and oncologist and mom's journey, and so I followed my brother to pharmacy school. My little brother, he graduated in 22. I graduated in 23. He took a more traditional career route and working in retail pharmacy and loves it. And I always wanted to do something to bridge my business experience and the obviously the PharmD. And so I sought the pharmaceutical industry pretty early and landed a role in regulatory affairs. And that's what I do by day. And by night, I work in my family business, kind of growing it. So we ended up coming back and purchasing the family business from my dad a couple of months ago.
Peyton, one of the things that strikes me, and I don't know if we've made this connection before, but we both share a background in family business. Now, you are living the family business day to day. My grandfather started a business and my dad took over. My dad started another business and since has sold those businesses and does other work with entrepreneurs. But I find it so interesting. My brother and I often talk about this that, when we were growing up, I think being around small business and just the discussion, the environment in your home, right? You just absorb so much of it. And I don't necessarily remember the conversations, but I think there was very much this aspect of being in the environment of it. And my dad would often share when I would ask about the family business, it was almost like this aspect of like, I don't really want you to take the family, like, you need to kinda go do your own thing, and so my brother and I went 2 very traditional pathways. He went into investment banking, I went into pharmacy, and now we have both found ourselves back in owning our own businesses, and I find that interesting. I would just love to hear your reflection on that, even as your mom, gave the permission to, "Hey, it doesn't always have to be the family business," and you and your brother went off to pharmacy school. Yeah, you're doing your pharmacy thing, but here you are, kind of attracted back to entrepreneurship. And I heard it in your voice as not one out of obligation, but really out of passion and interest in all the benefits and challenges, right? The Rubik's Cube of business is very real. And talk to us about that. Like, where does that magnetic pull and effect come for you? And I suspect your brother as well when it comes to entrepreneurship and small business.
I think that's a great question, and it is funny because I've listened to the episode with your dad and how you
Mm,
guys talked about the journey and how he coaches small business owners, and it's so funny because my dad's always had multiple businesses. He's been involved in the cattle industry, the feed store business. I mean,
mm,
all facets of it. And he started as an ag teacher, which is crazy of how he ended up owning his small business. And I think a lot of that was from my mom, and so it's kind of funny how it all kind of comes back to family in a lot of way because we saw the freedom that my parents had. Like, we were able to they attended every junior high football game. My brother was an all-American golfer. They traveled all over the country watching him play. And so that was sort of the draw. And I have a lot of flexibility in my current role as an industry pharmacist, being able to work remotely. And I envision myself doing that for a long time. But I think having the family business in the background has always been such a great backup plan now. And in a lot of ways on the weekends, that is sort of the focus. When I'm not at my 9 to 5, I'm focusing on this. And so I resonate a
Mhm.
lot with you in building YFP, you and Tim, and how that kind of, you were able to do both. And it was that draw to entrepreneurship. I think all of us at our core, we have a desire to want to improve something. We see an opportunity to
Yeah.
enhance a service, to enhance an audience, and we do that. And I think that's kind of at the core of what I want to do is continue my parents' legacy, but also carve out kind of the future of our
Mhm.
company as my brother and I see it. We've grown up in the business. By the time we're our parents' ages, we'll have significantly more experience in this area. And I don't think that's something that'll ever go away, whether it's the family business or we venture off to do something else together.
Yeah, you even shared before we hit record that here you are on your day off and you just came from a job this morning, right? Left your brother to finish a job and now we're recording the podcast. So that speaks to that variety and flexibility, that you're talking about. In that same breath, though, I suspect some of our listeners might be thinking, "Man, he's got a young family. You mentioned two young boys. You've got a full-time job that I'm sure is demanding in pharmacy. And then you're also doing this aspect of the family business. Just in terms of juggling and balancing that all, even on your day off, working, recording this podcast here, thoughts that you have on both that variety as well as just the balance and the flexibility of it as well?
I think I have to give a huge shout out to my wife. She was a school teacher and put me largely through school, and we can talk about the nuts and bolts of the financials, but she generated 70 to 80% of our income the entire time I was in school.
Mm,
And so now she has a little bit of like imposter syndrome of being a stay-at-home mom where she feels like she's not contributing. And then I have to remind her, like, Lindsay, you shouldered a lot of our financial obligations in the beginning when we first got married through a global pandemic, and the subsequent increases in the cost of living, even in rural East Texas. And I
yeah.
said, you have more than earned the right to work if you want to work, or not work if you don't want to work. And so
Mhm.
when we look at the cost of childcare that we're saving, when we look at the cost of her being able to prepare a lot of the boys' purees or baby led weaning, whatever we're doing this month, it's crazy how much money we save by her being a stay at home mom. And in a lot of ways, I tell her, you're working harder now than ever before because the boys are up at 8 a.m. They're awake until 7:30 p.m. at night. You have the occasional waking up in the middle of the night if they're upset or
Mhm.
have an illness. And so I know you can certainly relate, you and Jess, with the 4 boys. And so it's very much you're working hard. And by you
Yeah.
doing that, you're allowing me to take the risks that I've always wanted to take. We can live off of one of my incomes, and the other one is for hitting those big goals, those big why goals that we have in our life. And that is because you are sacrificing and staying home and helping raise our boys.
Yeah, and one of the things I hear in your voice is just the intentionality, and we'll talk about that in the specifics of the financials as well. But when I think of your background, your experiences, there's a lot of unique things, but I suspect there's a thread that brings all of these together, right? So whether it was serving as FFA president, being an entrepreneur, business owner, pharmacist, dad, like when you think of all of those, those are roles, right? Those are different roles that you have, different hats that you wear. But what's the common thread? Like, as you kind of put those together, what is the piece that for you brings that all together that you'll look back someday and say, yeah, that's what that was about?
That's a great question, and that's something Lindsay and I have actually talked about recently. The common thread, I think, is balance. Entrepreneurs are serial entrepreneurs have a really like tough balance problem. I've heard the Facebook saying that Mark Zuckerberg said of you get family, friends, life, social, and you have to pick three. And I don't necessarily ascribe to that because I don't want to be the very best in all five of those. I think having balance and giving 80 to 90% in all five of those cylinders, I think is good enough to be able to maintain your sanity. And so,
Mm,
I'm not trying to go out and get every single job in our family business. I'm not trying to take on every single responsibility at my day job. I'm not trying to raise the boys by myself. I realize that
mhm.
it's not necessarily a delegation. It's more so being at peace with what you're able to do because you are just human. And so
Mhm.
I think balance is a huge thing. And then also, one of the books that I actually found on one of your podcasts was Cal Newport's "So Good They Can't Ignore You," and he
Yeah.
talks about how the passion hypothesis is really flawed. That
Mhm.
passion alone is not good enough. And I've learned, especially early in my career and being late to pharmacy, coming in at 30 years old out of graduation as opposed to 24 or 26, it still takes time to build those technical skills. We're not really trained on what I do in my day job dealing with the
Mhm.
FDA. And so I've learned that there is a period of 3 to 5 years where you're sort of an apprentice. You've got to get your 10,000
Yep.
hours to become an expert. But I think being older has lended myself to that humility. Because at 22 out of school and undergrad, I thought I was ready to run my parents' business. And my dad told me it's going to take a while, and sure enough, 10 years is what it took for him to feel comfortable to turn over the reins to my brother and I. So I have such a profound respect for that. Of
Mhm.
it takes time to get really good, and as Cal says in the book, really good jobs take really good skills, and the passion often comes after the skills are developed. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the stacking of skills, one of the things that I know, I struggled with as a pharmacist, I see other pharmacists struggle with this, is we tend to, wear that hat, of course, as a pharmacist, and we have that identity as a pharmacist. But in any given environment you're in, whether you're in an industry role, whether you're in a hospital, health system, community practice, whatever, yeah, that is your role. You are a pharmacist, but you're also acquiring all these different skills and experiences. And when I think about your journey, it's not like the skills that you gain as a business owner, there's a wall between how you apply those and what you do in your workplace as a pharmacist, right? These things overlap, and we can stack these skills over time. And I love how there's variety in what you've done there as well. Let's talk about what probably a lot of listeners want to hear about, which is some of your financial journey and really the mindset and some of the tangible habits that have allowed you and your family to save over your half of your income and really make some financial progress, what I would say very early in one's career. And we know, because we talk about it all the time on this show, if we make progress early on in the career, time value of money, right? It's simple math that tells us we're going to put ourselves in a position for long-term financial success. So one of the things you've shared with me is that you said, hey, I worked like a resident, right out of high school. I've maintained that mindset. What did that look like in practice, and why did you make that choice?
that's a great question. And it's one I feel like a lot of pharmacists, if they would just embrace that, even for a season of life, it gives you such financial flexibility down the road. And you're never younger than you are today, right? So before kids, before a home, before taking care of old elderly parents, now is as good a time as any. And so, but you talk a lot on the show of how pharmacists have like a very unique ability to trade a very set of skills for a pretty desirable wage of
Hmm.
60, sometimes $80 an hour, depending on your workplace setting.
Yep.
And so that was something that I looked at, is that before our family is fully established, I need to take advantage of doing this until the family business comes along. And so Dr. Jim Dolly over at the White Coat Investor always
Mhm.
refers to, live like a resident. Well, I took kind of your advice of trading, that skill set for additional income and kind of combine the two. Like, let's live like a resident and also work like a resident, even if it's only for a year. In that
Yep.
1 year, we were able to save about $80,000 between retirement contributions,
Wow.
maxing our HSA, buttressing our savings account. We had very little savings after I came through school.
Mhm.
And that was only on 7 months of me working full time in industry and part time as a hospital pharmacist, while Lindsay worked until December of the year our first son, Heston, was born. And then she
Mhm.
said, it's really not worth me working anymore. And I said, I agree. We're in a position, our emergency fund is fully funded. We're really starting to automate a lot of our retirement investing, like you talk about on the show, and how that's
Mhm.
a great thing to do right when you get your job. So you never see your full
Yep.
paycheck come in. You automate a lot of that.
Mhm.
And that's what really built that foundation. And we continued to live on about $5,000 a month, which is what we had lived on the entire time we were in school, between her teaching salary and me working part time. And that's of course changed, after our home purchase. But that's what gave us the flexibility in that first year and allowed us to save almost 60% of our income that first year.
And what I really love about that, probably something we don't talk enough about, is that when you're in that mindset, and we're not suggesting this needs to be right the entirety of your career, but when you're in that mindset for a season because of a particular goal or financial situation, challenge, whatever it might be, it has a trickle effect well beyond that year, right? Sometimes we look at this, I often, will say with residents, in part to empathize with them, or fellows. Like when I was a resident in 2008, I made $31,000 as a resident, right? Thankfully, they pay residents a lot more than that now. But nonetheless, you're going to look at that income as, hey, this is half, less than half, a third, something like that of a pharmacist income. And regardless if somebody does a residency or not, that mentality of living like a resident or living like a fellow, yeah, it might be needed or required in that year, but it has a long-term benefit on your mindset. Because if you can instill those habits, and I think this is really what, they're talking about in the book, The Millionaire Next Door, in part, is if we can instill those habits over the long run and have an appreciation for, yeah, I make a really good income, but I've got disciplined savings and investings. I've got automation strategies. And as you point out, it's not always going to stay there, right? You buy a house, the family grows, expenses will naturally rise, but you've developed a system and you've developed an intentionality and a philosophy as a family that I think has benefits over the long, long term. So I love that advice. And I think it can carry on well beyond that year. Tell us a little bit more practically about when it comes to saving over half of your income, right? Single income household, 2 young kids, rising expenses, mortgage, the whole 9 yards. I think a lot of our listeners know why that's important if you're able to do it. Then there's the reality of how in the world do you actually do that, right? If you think about an average pharmacist salary, you think about home expenses, childcare costs, all these other things. I'll often run into situations where I might talk to a pharmacist that, hey, we've got a household income of maybe a couple $100,000, but they've got 75% of the income tied up in fixed costs, right? There's just not a whole lot of breathing room. So tell us a little bit more about practically, how did you do this as a strategy, get on the same page and implement it so that $5,000 number that you mentioned was something that you're able to work around?
Sure. So the first year, just to be completely transparent, we continued to rent. That whole first year, we stayed in the home that we rented while I was in school. It was a 3-bed, 2-bath rental home, about 1,400 square feet. And the rent had only increased over a 5-year period from 2019 to 2024, from $1,325 to $1,500. So not near as much as rents have increased in other parts of the country. And so with our
Yeah.
housing, less than 25%, even on a rental stake, which of our total expenses, not even our total income, our housing costs were about 7 or 8% of our total income at that time. That's where we were able to really, really save. And so
Yeah.
a lot of our family members were saying, why don't you guys buy a house? And I said, well, we're being very intentional about this. We want to have 6 months of emergency funds, when I go to being the sole income provider. And so by doing that, that gave us the flexibility. And Tim, I'll be honest, thank goodness we did, because the house we bought, it's a 30-year-old home in a really beautiful neighborhood. All the lots are half acres. It's plenty of room for my boys to run around. And we put 3% down on the home. We can get into like the mortgage decision and everything, because I'd be more than happy to talk about my experience with First
Yeah.
Horizon, and got a great rate at the time, significantly lower than what my friends were getting in March of 2024. But we've since put about 4 times our down payment into the home to fix things that were
Mm.
missed by the inspector. So that is the
Ah.
point of an emergency fund, is that we didn't
Yeah.
want to compromise on our savings rate. So we pulled from our emergency fund and have spent the last few months building it back up. And
Got
so
it.
by buying a home within what we could afford, keeping it reasonable, even though the payment is significantly more than what our rent was, I think that's just the nature of the economy right now. And so
Mhm.
unless you've of course got 50% to put down on a home, which not a lot of new pharmacists do. So
Yeah.
but that's pretty much how we did it. We continued renting. That kept our housing costs really low. Both of our vehicles were new in 2018, so they were all paid off. And thank goodness we bought vehicles before the pandemic started. We didn't
Yeah.
predict it that way. So we've saved a lot on vehicle and housing costs, which are 2 of the biggest costs that pharmacists typically
Absolutely.
have. So
Yeah, the big 4 that I see, you've probably heard me share this before. The big 4 that I see for pharmacists, especially if they're in that first, decade to 2 is, student loans, housing costs, childcare costs, and car payments, right? Those are the big 4. And I'm not judging any one of those, right? That's just a reality of what I see in the numbers. And so you kind of addressed all of those, right? In terms of your approach of used cars, keeping your housing costs down, childcare costs you talked about as well. When you think about sacrifice, right? Anytime we make a financial decision, there's always an opportunity cost. I love to think about this because, it can be that we're choosing to, hey, not, in your example, you said, hey, my wife's going to stay at home. There's an opportunity cost to that, right? In terms of earnings, there's also expenses that you're saving on, right? When it comes to buying versus renting, there's opportunity costs there. And so it's important that we think about this concept of intentional decision making and sacrifices, whatever you want to call them. Renting is one I heard that, hey, we potentially maybe we would have liked to be in a house a little bit sooner, but we saw that that was a space that we were able to keep our housing fixed costs very low, allowed us to save more. Any other major sacrifices you felt like you were making? I know often people will say, well, I don't want to live on rice and beans, right? So I want to be able to also live my life today, which we think is important as well. Anything else you'd add to the sacrifices, housing being one big one?
Yeah, housing is really the biggest one. That was something that my wife really wanted to do when we got married, was to buy a home, and just on our limited income or fixed income at the time, it didn't really make a lot of sense. Now looking back, I wish we would have locked in even a small starter home, at a sub 3% mortgage rate, but hindsight's
Yeah.
always 2020, right? And
Yeah.
so I joke all the time is that, my wife and I, we did a lot of family planning and decided, when we wanted to have kids. And I think that's probably the biggest sacrifice we made with me going back to school, is that we're not old parents by any means, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we do have a lot of friends that became parents in their early to mid 20s. And so they're able to, I'll be a little older when my boys are in high school, but I'm hoping to stay in shape because they'll keep me in shape.
Experienced,
Yeah,
experience.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the gray
Yeah.
hair speaks there. And so
That's right.
that's one of the things I feel like we did sacrifice. But in terms of like spending, we're not big vacation folks. Like we see family. Her family lives in Indiana, and so that's always kind of a fun trip. We haven't made it the last couple of years with little boys, but during school we went pretty often. My wife went once or twice a year. She has extended family in Arkansas that we would travel to, and my family still lives here. And so we really didn't feel like we were missing in terms of like travel. I know a lot of pharmacists like to travel, and I think we want to be more intentional about when the boys are, in their adolescence years or maybe preteens. Maybe that's when we take our big Disney World trip or somewhere like that, because we do want them to have experience outside of East Texas. We do want them to kind of see the world like we've been able to,
Mhm.
but we want to be very intentional about when we do that. And our dollars, we have a better use for our dollars right now than taking two little boys around on an airplane, and so, or in the
Mhm.
car. So that's really the only area I feel like we've sacrificed, is just delaying to have children until after school. But I always tell the joke, Tim, that my wife wanted to have babies. She wanted to be, as she said, big pregnant when I graduated. And so I said, well, I'd rather work a year as a pharmacist because we could save my whole income. And so I graduated in April. I started my job May 1st, and our first son was born in June. So we ended up
Oh,
having the
man.
baby,
Oh,
right after
man.
school. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's fun. That's fun. One of the other things I think about for those that are able to build that strong foundation early on, right? And I've talked at length on the show about what that looks like. But once you build a strong foundation, especially if you don't have a large percentage of your income that's tied up in fixed costs, you have margin that you're saving, is that it gives you options, it gives you flexibility. And that could be in the form of a job loss, that could be in a form of emergency, that could be, desire for a job change. It could be a bunch of things. But here in particular, I'm thinking about your situation and the opportunity that came forward to buy into the family business. And can you speak to that for a moment? How was setting up a strong financial foundation, how is that important to allowing you to be in a position to be able to buy into the family business?
I love this question. And I'll start it by caveat by saying I went through the fellowship recruitment process to earn a fellowship with a major pharmaceutical company and was actually offered a position, but it was not able to be remote, unfortunately. And so I made what a lot of people say was career suicide by saying no to a fellowship offer I was given. No one from my school had ever done anything in industry, but I knew I wanted the family business to be a core of my future. And by moving
Mhm.
to Pennsylvania or New Jersey, I would be giving that up, at least for a pretty good season of my life. And I knew I didn't want to transition into a field role where I could move back home because field roles typically mean a lot of travel. And so I held out for a remote position because I would hope that through my generations going through pharmacy school, those of us that graduated and became licensed, we've proven we are resilient, and remote work is here to stay for a lot of roles. And so I held out, and then a few mentors turned colleagues were able to leverage me a position with a company I had interviewed for a fellowship for. And so with that background in mind, I took a reasonable pay cut as opposed to what a traditional pharmacist would be, being in an industry role. But industry roles, typically you're a little lower on the front end in income, but there's no ceiling on your earnings,
Or upward
unlike there
mobility,
is
yeah.
with a lot of
Mhm.
more traditional roles. And so I knew, with the way my compensation model works, is that over time that will grow, it will double, it will triple by end of career. And so that allowed me to take the risk of, if I can live on this and we don't elevate our lifestyle, that will put us in a position so that I can also use some of my time and resources to purchase the family business and grow the family business on nights and weekends. And so that has been the biggest thing, is that taking that risk of holding out for a role that had flexibility, so that on nights and weekends I had bandwidth to give to the business. That was the biggest key in being able to get the business and grow it to where we want to grow it.
Man, that's so good. What's coming to mind for me is Simon Sinek's work, Start With Why, right? Where you have the why in the center of the circle, and then you've got the how and the what as you get out to the perimeters, right? And what I love about your example of, deciding the fellowship path wasn't necessarily the best route for you, that was clear because you were clear on the why of where you were wanting to go. That was your North Star, right? And when that's your filter, one of the guys in my men's group talks about this as inside out living versus outside in living, meaning that we're living from a place of clarity around where we want to go, why we want to go there, who we want to be, what's most important to us, rather than, you think about a traditional fellowship type of pathway be, well, why are you going to say no to that? Right? There's 1,800 applicants for 80 spots or whatever. And it becomes easier. I'm not going to say it was easy, but it becomes easier to say no to an opportunity like that because you did the self-reflection and had the awareness of, this is what I want. This is why I want it. And this opportunity in the form of a job as a pharmacist has to be in alignment with where I want to go. And so I just want to slow down and emphasize that because I think it's so important. And obviously that has tentacles into the financial plan of how we make that a reality. You talked about the upward mobility and everything of an industry pharmacist role. Absolutely. But so can also come with industry roles or some of the volatility that can be there. And so we've got to have a good foundation in place. And what I hear as a thread in your voice, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you do some of this hard work early on, it really does change someone's mindset. There's an emotional piece. There's a posture of gratitude. And there's not a math equation you can always put on that, of the value of that, right? But when you have a solid foundation and you're living from that place of clarity, there's momentum that comes from that isn't always easy to measure. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I think you nailed that.
Awesome. Let's talk about the home purchase, right? Because I think that, even in a lower-ish cost of living market, I mean, I would argue Dallas is not, but it sounds like you're a little bit northeast.
A little further
of
away,
that.
yeah.
Okay. But I know some of our friends from the Northeast or out west in the DC metro area, they hear rents like $1,300 and they're like, in what world do these people live, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the realities of pharmacists, is that we don't see incomes translate with cost of living. But nonetheless, no matter where you live in the country, buying a home in the last 5 years, let's just call it for what it is, right? It's been a challenging process with interest rates, appreciation, all types of decisions. So tell us a little bit more about that home purchase decision. What made you decide to pull the trigger, even when it looked like, hey, rates aren't going to really budge a whole lot, and haven't budged a whole lot here in the last year?
I love that question because it's one that I ask myself pretty much every day after we moved into the home, because I am, like, my undergrad is in agricultural economics. And so opportunity cost was a core learning part of my undergraduate degree. And I'll be honest, Tim, I'm a spreadsheet guy. I kept a spreadsheet that
I know
showed
you are.
the
Yes.
difference between my rent and my mortgage and all of the hidden costs of home ownership, like the lawn care, because
Yeah.
I'm not here to do it on the weekends. The maintenance, we've replaced a septic system, some drywall. Fortunately, the seller put a roof on the house for us, so we saved that. But yeah, I stopped counting in February or March of this year. We weren't even a year into the home, and between the opportunity cost of my down payment, everything else, it was about $70,000 of what the difference would have been. And I said, well, we had the 50 that we were prepared to spend on the home between down payment, the rest we've cash flowed. And it was at that moment that I finally understood what you and Tim talk about of, the home, it can be an investment. We know returns are not as great as maybe equities or some other
Yeah.
private investments. It's a use asset. And so when I finally made peace with that, I've always known it as an economist, but when I finally made peace with that, is that, hey, this is a use asset. And the best part is it's not like my truck. It's not going to go down to 50% of what I paid for it.
Yeah.
Even if I get what I paid for it, we're not that upside down on it if we decide to sell someday. And so that was the big moment that clicked. But to answer your question, I immediately, once I saw we had a sizable cash reserves, I was able to carve out 6 months of an emergency for one bucket, and the other bucket was for the home purchase. I told my wife, I said, hey, if you want to start looking, you can look. And you've mentioned many times on this show that when you start looking, it's 2 weeks later, you're under contract. Well, especially in a market like this, when there's very few offers going out. But I use that to my advantage. I thought, well, if there's not a lot of offers going out and we're able to get into the home really quickly and we're able to get an inspection done like you weren't able to do a couple of years ago, the mortgage market should be pretty competitive. And so I
Mhm.
started with a big box mortgage realtor or big box mortgage provider, and then also used First Horizon. And First Horizon was great. Like we would go back and forth on the truth in lending statement. We would go back and forth on points, on origination
Mm,
fees, and First Horizon was actually able to compare not only a Pharmacist home loan product for me, but a conventional loan. And they said, based
mhm.
on your credit score and the fact that you guys have paid off some pretty big assets on a limited income with your vehicles, you get our best rate. We can offer you 6.5% when everyone else is getting about 6.75 or 8
Yeah.
or 7 with
Mhm.
some points. And so that actually ended up beating the big mortgage retailer. And so I was able to secure a conventional loan with a little bit of PMI, but the total monthly cost came out less than what the Pharmacist home loan product was because
Mhm.
we qualified for the conventional loan. And so that was really neat to be able to go through that process because it's a very competitive time in getting loans. Not a lot of folks at the time, and even now, the refinance market's ticking up a little bit as rates have come
Yeah.
down, 0.5%. But since I got my loan, but there's not a lot of folks applying for mortgages. So that would be my
Mhm.
message to the audience: is if you're in the home market, shop around. You were able to get a pretty decent deal aside from the interest rate. So
Yeah, and you make a really good point about that what you start to work with on a lender, if the lender is really looking out for you and kind of understand your situation, they may Tony's talked about this from First Horizon on the show before, where for some borrowers, it might be just because of rates and offerings and products where an FHA product makes more sense. And you gotta
exactly.
do the whole math, right? And factor in the PMI and all of that. So, that's a huge help when you have someone that can really evaluate and shop the market for you. Let me ask you, and this is not intended to be a commercial for First Horizon, but really I want to pull back the curtain a little bit on your decision. So did you end up going 20% down on a conventional, or did you do the 3% down
We did the
on
3% for the first time home
3%?
buyer. Yeah.
Okay, so a little bit of PMI in that, obviously, as you mentioned, that makes sense. So as someone who is maybe a little bit more on the financial conservative side of things, how did you reconcile what can be a big decision, right? Versus, I put 20% down, I've got a little bit more equity in the home, I lower my monthly payment, I feel a little bit more confident that, hey, if there's some market volatility where we have to unexpectedly move, I've got some built-in cushion. I've got an use asset, as you said. I love that term. And I have some equity in that use asset that I could use if or when I needed it, right? Secondary emergency fund, whatever. So that's one pathway. But obviously, there's an opportunity cost to that of a large chunk of cash. If you're buying a $500,000 home, 20% down, we need to come up with $100,000. Versus if we're buying a $500,000 home, 3%, we need $15,000. Now, that 3% decision, sometimes that might make people feel a little bit anxious in terms of, hey, do I have enough equity in the home, or could I be underwater on this mortgage? So talk us through your thought process on how you got to the 3% and how you felt comfortable with that decision.
That's a great question. A lot of it was forward thinking, and so that's kind of dangerous when you start to get the crystal ball out. It's very hard. Everyone's is cloudy, but I thought I could see a little bit through mine with the business. I knew the business we would be getting in the next year or two. My dad was getting really burnt out. It's very much an on-call type of business because our largest customers are hospitals. And so I knew that at some point in the next 5 years, we were probably going to purchase the home, which meant my tax strategy was going to move from a standard deduction to an itemized deduction situation.
Yep.
And so, with that being in mind, I thought, okay, if we're going to be itemizing our taxes, probably beginning in tax year 2025, which is this year, I said it makes sense to carry a little bit of mortgage interest. Obviously, that's not ideal, and 3% down, there is a risk. But the downside risk was kind of nice because if the home did go down in value, because I only put 3% down, I know I'd have to stay here quite a while. And so the value would likely rebound over a 10 to 15-year period because the house is about 2,600 square feet. And just in all transparency, it's the median house price in America now. Our house was about 420, which means 5 years ago, this house was $300,000. It was considered almost a starter
Wild.
home in our area.
Wild.
And so, we ask ourselves all the time, like, how in the world would we have done this if my wife was a teacher and I worked part time for my dad? We would never be able to afford this home. And so that was where the calculus came into there. Is that okay? We know our mortgage payment will be about two, maybe 2.5 times our rent payment. However, we are going to be getting $300 to $500 of equity on every payment. And we're planning on being here long enough that if it does go down, since we've had such this run up in values, if for some reason values go down, we're planning on being here longer than 5 years, which
Mhm.
I feel like, Dr. Dolly talks about on the White Coat Investor. You and Tim and Tony have talked about 5 years is kind of that sweet spot of if you're not going to be in an area or be in a position for 5 years, it doesn't always make sense to buy.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of our forward thinking attitude.
How about the affordability question? It's another common one that comes up is how much home can I afford, right? And that's hard because sometimes the market dynamics will drive that. People might say, "Hey, I budgeted and it really is like three through 50," but then they look at what they get for 3 through 50, and all of a sudden the budget creeps up. So when you looked at that 420-ish, if I heard you correctly, 420-ish purchase price, how did you determine that that was an amount that you felt comfortable in terms of affording and fitting into the rest of the financial plan?
Yeah, so when I say 420, it still makes my stomach churn quite a bit. Even though our income has gone up a lot in the last 18 months, it still makes me churn because, I always stuck to the 25% rule of, okay,
Mm,
25% of my pre-tax income, I want to be my all-in housing costs. And I was really nervous when my mortgage payment alone was creeping up into the high 20s because that
mhm,
meant, on a $3,500 mortgage or 32 at the time, I needed to gross 160,000, and I'm doing that between my full time role working for my dad and my part time PRN role at the hospital
mhm.
that I would work once a month. And I thought, well, if I give up the PRN role and we get the business, my income will double or triple depending on how the business does. And so I didn't want that to factor in, though. I wanted to be able to say on my current income, I don't want my housing costs to exceed 25%. Now,
Mhm.
that was still a lion's jump from where I was in renting, which is why I just had to turn off the opportunity cost mindset and realize that, hey, you're still getting a little equity at worst. My house is the same
Yeah,
price in 5 years. But there should be a 2 to 3% appreciation rate. Now, of course, the real return's not going to be quite that, but maybe we get into a really, really good seller's market in 5 years. I have no
yep,
idea. The reality is that this is my home. It's a use asset. I want my boys to have a big backyard to play in, and we've checked a lot of those boxes. And so I just had to turn off the financial part
yeah.
of it for a minute.
And what you just said there to me is the part of real return on investment that we can't put a number to. That's what I always talk about, right? It's a use asset. If I break even, lose a little bit, if I look at the net all-in cost, so be it. But when I think about, my boys now 14 down to 6, a number of memories we've had in these walls. Now you got to be careful. That can lead to rationalization of any purchase, right? But the number of memories and shared experiences and having a place of stability that you can call home, being in a community, like that needs to be factored into the real rate of return. And that's obviously hard to do
Absolutely,
mathematically.
and we have fantastic neighbors with kids just a couple of years older, and then
Awesome.
a couple that's about my dad's age right next door. So it's fantastic. It's an amazing community. Not to say where we were renting was, but there was a lot of turnover in a lot of rental communities. But this feels like home in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So
Let's talk about the family business. Tell us about the family business. You alluded to a little bit about what you do. Name of the business as you're willing to share. What you guys do in terms of the offering, the target market, and how that opportunity came to be to acquire the business. Because you mentioned that there was a period where your dad was alluding to getting ready, right? Getting ready with the experience to be able to run a business. So tell us about the business and how that opportunity came to be.
absolutely. I could probably do a whole podcast on this part, but I'll try to be succinct. So, my mom and dad started this business in 1995. It started as a small janitorial company that my mom was running to kind of help supplement my dad's teaching income. And then when my dad, realized in the mid 90s that we would probably never be financially independent on a rural ag teacher salary, he went to work for my mom. And as he describes it, they were partners, but he really worked for my mom. And so that business transformed from a janitorial company to largely just a boutique carpet cleaning company. We would come in and perform carpet cleaning services for apartment complexes, et cetera. And then that sort of morphed into like a healthcare specialty company. My
Mm.
dad had a degree, a super professional most of the time. My mom was really great at working with people and was an amazing people person. And so they were kind of like a duo of my mom would go out and sell accounts and would generate income for the business, and my dad would do the work. And they've been through some employees through the years, but my dad is very type A. Like no one can do the work as good as me. I don't delegate very well. And so we were always kind of bottlenecked in terms of our growth, but we never needed anything growing up. We were certainly not
Uh,
rich by any means,
mhm.
but we never needed anything growing up. And so I saw that flexibility and thought, yeah, I would love to be able to have the business someday. And so when I got out of undergrad, I pushed my dad to get more into residential services. We were doing commercial carpet cleaning for 3 large hospitals in our area, and it was mostly night work. And so I said, well, Dad, why don't we try to build a residential arm now that I'm out and I can sell accounts during the day or I can go clean homes. And so that's what I did for 2.5 years. And that part of the business really took off, that and our property management business. And then when I went back to school, obviously that kind of had to stop,
Yeah.
especially with it just being dad now after mom had passed. And so we've since come back after the pandemic. Environmental services were really in the spotlight during the pandemic, as
Mhm.
you can imagine. At the time we thought the virus could grow anywhere. And so, that's where cleaning and sanitation really took off in
Mhm.
hospitals. And so our business skyrocketed during that time and has since remained at that level of volume. And so over time, the biggest thing with the business was just raising our price. My dad was really big on being, this is my price. And he never really knew what his true costs were. And so
Yeah.
that was where I was able to help him with the business degree he helped pay for of, hey, dad, like, here's the market rate. Here's what our actual cost is per square foot of carpet. This is kind of what I would charge. And so that's been the biggest fulcrum of allowing my dad to have some retirement savings, is that now he's being reimbursed at the market rate. But I think he was just tired of getting the calls late at night of there was a toilet overflow in a physician's office. Can
Mhm.
we get you guys out to clean it before he's there or she's there in the morning? And so we said, well, Dad, we're young, we're happy to do that, and we decided to purchase the business from him, and we can get into all the nuts and bolts of like the strategy and what the tax structure looks like. That was really fun for me to kind of use what I've
Yeah.
learned listening to you guys and my degree on what is the best way to structure the business. How should we go about a purchase agreement? All those were really cool things that were a part of the negotiation.
Yeah, and it's not always that family business acquisitions, especially when there's siblings involved, go well.
Yes.
My dad and I talked a little bit about this on the podcast that you referenced earlier, and so, you know, not to say that all went seamless necessarily here either, but to have some of the intentionality and the desire, for I think really wanting it to be fair for all parties, right? Because I think that if you come from that mindset and that lens, and everyone's willing to compromise a little bit in the process, you really want to leave these, I don't even call them negotiations, right? It's family, but you want to leave these types of conversations in a way that, hey, this is coming from a place of love. You've done an incredible job of getting this business up and running. We see opportunities for how it can grow and scale, get it to market rates, and really take it to the next level. But in order to do that, like, you got to let go a little bit. And we got to take this thing, to the next level. So I'm curious because you referenced to me before we recorded that 15% year over year growth in revenue, which is awesome. As you and your brother have really taken the helm of that. And I really sense that opportunity from growth, comes from the foundation of the business that was built, the relationships that were there. I think about though, and this industry way better than I do, but I'm familiar with at least one I'm thinking about big box player in this space, right? I always see their vans pulling up, right, at fitness facilities and other places where they're rolling out their carpets and putting the old ones into the van. Like, how do you, as a small business in this environment against some of these bigger players, how do you compete not only to stay alive as a business, but to grow year over year and thrive as a business?
That's a fantastic question, and yes, I do know several companies that are the like ones you refer. The biggest thing is accessibility, and so we really pride ourselves on the fact that everyone in our family has a college degree. Certainly, not to knock another business that doesn't, but it just you're dealing with a different kind of person that has the respect for what you do as an office manager, as a physician, as a nurse practitioner, wherever we may be. And we've carved out our niche. Like 80% of our revenue comes from commercial carpet cleaning from healthcare facilities or school
Wow.
districts. And so right now we're diversifying, right? We're spending about 80 to $90,000 of our earnings this year to outfit our rug cleaning shop. So that the only residential services we provide are for high-end rug cleaning. And we've had rugs brought to us from Dallas, from Houston, and everywhere in between. Just from folks that don't want to have to drive through the big city. They'd rather come out to their country house or their lake house, gather up all their rugs and bring them to us. And, my brother and I, like you, we've had a lot of hours in chemistry. So we understand the chemistry behind a lot of
Mhm.
the chemicals that we use. We will not ruin your, five-digit rug or six-digit rug. We've had one six-digit rug that we cleaned that we couldn't
Wow.
believe how much. Yeah, it's an investment rug that they bought and have kept passed it down through generations. We were very, very particular with that one. And
Yeah.
so that's just what we love, is that we figured out a niche of this industry. It's very much an industry that doesn't cost a lot to get into. So there's a lot of fly by night companies that typically come up during major,
Mhm.
tough economic times. And we've been here through all of it. My dad's had it for 30 years. My brother and I grew up doing it. We swore we would never do it when we were adults. And here we are, we own the business. And so, because just like today, we were out cleaning carpet this morning, and
Yeah.
and so just leveraging that flexibility. He's now PRN as a pharmacist at a big retail chain, and so he has that flexibility. And my brother, I'm really really proud of him. Like he is the operations manager for the business. I'm reading the book right now, Rocket Fuel. And I'm
Oh,
very
good
much the
one.
visionary. He's very much
Mhm.
the I forgot. I think it's the exit, the
Integrator?
operation integrator.
Mhm.
And so we complement each other a lot. But there's also some overlap. Like he is the one driving our rug business, and so like I am really proud of him for like stepping up and being willing to take that on. And then I manage a lot of the relationships with the hospital
Mhm.
because I have the flexibility in my job to respond to them in some downtime. And so
Do you see a question I'm thinking about is, 5, 7, 10 years. I don't know what the timeline is, but you look at you have the ingredients for a very successful small business that's profitable to grow, right? You've got clearly identified roles and responsibilities of ownership. You've got a niche market. You're doing all the things in terms of having good financial backgrounds to understand what are our true costs, what's potential profitability, how do we reinvest some of this profit back into the business, in a strategic way that we have the longer term in mind. So to me, it feels like outside of external forces that can have an impact on any business, if you're doing 15% year over year growth, you wake up in 5 years, this is a very different animal, if you will, right? Because it either, and correct me if I'm wrong, it either gets to a point where you have to start hiring more people, which means now one or both of you is a manager of people, which can be a blessing and a curse, depending on how you look at it. Maybe potential acquisition opportunities that are out there. But nonetheless, unless you're building it in an intentional way that would do otherwise, a business is growing 15% year over year, just compounding, right? It's simple math. 5, 7, 10 years, this is going to be a very different business, which therefore may require a very different amount of your time. You have a young family, you have a great job. So as you look at the future of the business and the trajectory of where it could go, the future of your own family and the trajectory of where that could go, and the future of your pharmacy job and the trajectory of where that can go, is it hey, let's figure that out when we get there? Or do you see one of these paths on the pharmacy or the business side taking up more of a piece of your time?
So that's actually our current dilemma, Tim, is that my business or my job is getting a little bit more demanding. I'm hopefully going to be taking over a little bit more responsibility in my day job, and so my brother has been amazing at being flexible. We do have one part-time employee that's a good family friend of ours, that picks up about 2 of the nights per week, and then the other 5 my brother and I typically do, and then of course the weekends are all day events. And so going back to 2017, and I'll be completely transparent, the business revenue was hovering around $200,000 or 225, and we had a massive shock year where one of our largest hospital clients was acquired by a national health network. And so
Mm,
they got rid of all outside contracting services
contracts,
for
yeah.
about 12 months. And so we've been through that sort of shock year of like the external forces you can't imagine. And we've sort of diversified our business by adding the other 2 hospital networks on more like stringent schedules. And then, of course, increase our prices to reflect the quality of the work and the accessibility that managers have to the owners. They can call us 24/7, and either my brother or I have the business phone and can answer their questions. And you don't really get that from a lot of our
Yeah.
competitors. And so
Mhm.
that's another big value add of we could justify a higher than market rate, but we try to be fair, because we've had such great business relationships with these clients. And so when you talk about the growth now, when we bought the business from our dad, we were expecting to do about $40,000 a month in revenue, or just under half a million. Well, we've surpassed that number in 9 months since we took over in April.
Wow.
So we're on track to hit over 600,000 in revenue, and our cost of goods and total net income, our margins end up being about 40% in this business because we do the work ourselves.
Yep.
If you factor in what we pay ourselves, we're really netting about 59 to 60% of the total
Yep.
income. And so it's a great problem to have, of an income problem of how do we be strategic. And so we've set up 3 months of reserves, through an online savings account. We have a month of expenses in checking. And now
Yep.
we have this profit distribution problem of, okay, what do we want to do to be more strategic about how we allocate these resources to be set up for the long term. And the first
Mhm.
order of business is finding a full-time employee. And so
Yep.
that's kind of where we are now, is to take a lot of the working in the business off of us so that we can work on the business. And I know, like you said, if our business continues on this and rug cleaning takes off, it's not uncommon, or it may not be out of the realm to expect that by the time my kids are in kindergarten, we'll have a seven-figure business. Our
Yeah.
margin percentage might be lower, but we hopefully will keep the amount high enough to be able to support families. But we pay about double what a traditional carpet cleaning company pays a technician.
Yeah.
And so we're able to attract someone who's just like us. He has a full-time job, working in HR, and he does this on the weekends for extra money. And that's kind of been our approach, is that because we're able to do that, we do so much volume at market prices, we're able to pay folks considerably more to
Mhm.
come and work for us.
Yeah, what I love about that, right, is it's so rewarding to be able to create, in this case, you've got a family business that is offering a product or service that's needed and valued, that has strong relationships with your clients that you work with. All the while, it's profitable, which is good, but also you're able to pay people at an above market wage rate and provide a good opportunity, for people there as well. I mean, I love that. And where I see you guys going, when you talk about, that next hire, it's that E-Myth mentality of, I'm working on the business, not in the business. Typically, that means maybe a step back in profitability. My dad talks about this as kind of entering the next plateau, where you get on that next landing place to sort of figure out, what do you need to do operationally? What do you need to do in terms of the systems, the profitability, to take the next jump from, say, 500,000 in revenue to 1,000,000 revenue, right? And then it might be $1,000,000 to $2,000,000 in revenue. Let me ask, as I start to land the plane here, I'd love to hear more about your why. Because when we talk about all of this, right, and I think there's so many interesting aspects to your story, but I have no question that you and your brother are gonna build a successful business. I have no question that because you guys have put yourself in such a strong financial position, saving over half your income, reaching a positive net worth in a very short period of time out of school, and you have good discipline and behaviors and habits, like, outside of a catastrophe, like, you're going to build wealth long term without question, right? But I know you know this from listening to the show, like, those aren't the only things that matter. Those aren't the end points alone. They're good things, they're good goals, but there usually is a driving why. What I have found, and I remember reading this in the Millionaire Next Door and pairing it with some other things, there's often, when you look at people that have built real wealth, there's typically some type of drive, motivation, something behind it, which has allowed their income and these opportunities to fuel and build the wealth. But you talk to them, it isn't about the net worth of $10,000,000 or $5,000,000 or $15,000,000. And in fact, there might be some goals that they have financially. Of course, many of them do, but there's usually a much deeper why that's behind all that. And I'd love for you just to reflect on that for a moment, if you could speak to what that might be for you and your family.
This is probably my favorite question of all time, and it's one that my wife and I have been very, very intentional about. And so there's really two reasons. The first is of why I went to pharmacy school, and why, even if the business were a $10 million business, I would still want to practice as a pharmacist, specifically in oncology. And that goes back to my mom's health journey. We were not a very health literate family. My mom was a lifelong smoker. Looking back at some of her symptoms and reading her chart, and then ultimately seeing on her death certificate COPD and ARDS. I know that there were a lot of choices that my family made from a health perspective that robbed us of some really beautiful memories and years. And that's not to judge my mom or anyone who smokes, but it's just to be aware of the consequences of some of your health decisions. And I think health literacy is at the core of that. And I think even as a country, that's something that America could improve upon, as we learn in pharmacy school of how to talk to patients. You can't talk to them like you would talk to a provider. And while patients may never be at the provider level of understanding, we could certainly do to elevate that nationally. And that's one of the reasons I work in oncology, is that I understand what it's like to have been through that, even though I'm in regulatory and see no patients whatsoever. Being able to be on the backbone of the submissions and the drug approval process gives me a sincere appreciation for every family's journey, whether that's cancer related or not cancer related. And so I always want that to be at the core of reminding myself of, I left the business to go to pharmacy school because of this reason. And so even if the business were tenfold more successful, this is still a core of who I am now. I am tied inextricably to health literacy and oncology and cancer awareness. The second part of that why is being content with what we have. I don't think Lindsay or I, if you would have told us in 2018 on the eve of our marriage or the day of our marriage that we would have this abundance, and not abundance of dollars or abundance of opportunity, but just abundance of peace. Abundance of confidence
Hmm.
and love for where we are. Thursday nights are date nights, and I don't let anything compromise a date night. I was mentoring a student yesterday who's trying to land a fellowship, and I said, "Hey, I do have to go," and she understood. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You've got family, you've got date night. And I really appreciated that because it's like that. That is a part of my personality. People know that I want to be intentional about that time. And we just sat out by the fire pit in the backyard and watched the embers kind of burn down. And I looked at Lindsay and I said, I'm getting to go on a podcast tomorrow that inspired me to take this
Mm,
mindset of building this wealth. And I get to sit across from a chair from somebody I really appreciate and can see the work that he's done. And I was like, it's come full circle. I was like, there's just something about, we're not at the retirement number we need to stop
sure.
working. And we're not, our house is not paid off. I've still got some student loans that have been on pause that we're paying back now. And I feel like we've arrived at the destination in our life that we always wanted to be in. And that is kind of where I am, is just being present and being intentional, and realizing that the joy is in the details. The joy
Yeah.
is in the day to day. So
Yeah. Man, I feel a lot of joy and gratitude for that. So thank you for sharing that. And I think what you just shared there is so much wisdom. We often talk about, living this rich life. And if we're not careful, we can constantly be aspiring towards a day when we'll live that rich life. When you share that story, to me, the rich life is sitting out back, watching the embers, having the conversation, slowing down, treasuring the moment. Those are the moments. Those are the moments, right? And I think it's having that perspective. Bill Perkins talks about this in Die with Zero.
yes.
It's those moments, and he talks about this as the experience dividend. The more of those that we have, and we're able to stack those and grow those and remember those and treasure those experiences, those are the things that we are going to remember if we're afforded the opportunity to live in our 70s, 80s, or 90s, right? Because if we do all the things, if we check all the boxes, we're gonna have millions of dollars. It's math. But when you talk to people that have actually built that, that rarely is the reason or the motivation. It's those experiences, it's the opportunities, it's the connections that we have with family. Often there's philanthropic goals that are in there as well. So just a beautiful, beautiful description of the value of living that rich life today while you continue to plan, right? You're not saying you've arrived, you're continuing to plan for the future, but also treasuring the moments that you have here right now. Beautiful. This has been an inspiring conversation. I love how you have shown, how you've described the intentional financial choices, especially early in your career, how they can really create some of the flexibility and freedom later on. I think you're just getting started on that as well. We talked about saving half of your income, over half your income, growing your family's business, having the opportunity in that family's business, some of the purpose-driven work that you're doing in the oncology space. I think your story really embodies what we mean when we say on repeat about living a rich life today and living a rich life tomorrow. So, Peyton, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope we have the opportunity to maybe have you on again in the future.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I want to thank you and Tim for the organization you guys have built, for new grads, anybody mid-career, late career. There's a lot of wisdom in this group. And whether you listen to one podcast or all of them, like I have, there's a lot that you can learn from these guys. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is an experience of a lifetime, Tim. So thank
Mm,
you.
really appreciate that. Means a lot, Peyton. Thank you. Have a good one. Do us a favor and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and the corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.